many perspectives. So without further ado, I would like to present the speakers at our panel today. I will be your moderator, and we'll have the help of our communications manager, Tushar Gaikwad, to help us in the Q&A session. So I will give the floor to our first honorable speaker, Ms. Kulani Vijayabahu. She's a PhD candidate at the Department of Politics in the University of Otago here in New Zealand. She's writing the thesis comprehending the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative on Good Governance Agenda, a case study on Sri Lanka. Kulani is interested in policy and good governance, and she's concerned by the issue of dependence and the role of China as a donor in recipient countries. So I give you the floor, Kulani, so we are eager to hear you.
Yes, thank you so much for your kind introduction to me. I think my slides are visible now. Greetings from Colombo. It's morning to here. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk about Belt Road Initiative and its impact on Sri Lanka, which is highly contested, highly debated phenomenon in the local politics these days too. And there are very intense situations are going on in Sri Lanka. However, I would like to say at the very outset of this presentation that I'm still at the initial level of my research. Therefore, your constructive feedback, your critiques are highly appreciated. What is Belt Road Initiative? Even though there are a lot of academic articles, scholarly discussions on how to interpret, how to define a Belt Road Initiative, yet I think the nature of BRI from the perspective of small states have not been explored in an extensive level. Because even though we say Belt Road Initiative as the introductory remark mentioned, it's a flagship foreign policy initiative of China, or even it's as the global infrastructure strategy. Do you think does it cover the gains of smaller states, its vulnerability to cause or its further deepening asymmetry due to this initiative or other externalities due to this footfall, especially that small states are enjoying or suffering at the moment because of Belt Road Initiative. Therefore, this is the major guiding question of my entire research. But today I'm going to present one small portion of my research to this platform. When it comes to the introduction, you can see I have here mentioned two major concepts that are in international relations and political science. The one is economic statecraft, the other one is the intervention. So in order to contextualize BRI from the perspective of small states, I try to use these two lenses to look at or contextualize how BRI works in small states, especially taking Sri Lanka and one of the BRI projects in Sri Lanka. This slide demonstrates the conceptual and the empirical scope of the presentation today. I think empirical scope is very much clear because I have taken Belt Road Initiative as the zoom out picture. Then I narrow it down to the Sri Lanka as the BRI recipient country, and among several BRI projects that are being constructed in Sri Lanka, I have paid my attention to Habantuta Port project, which has been extensively cited by several scholars as the to convince the world that BRI is a debt trap diplomacy of China. And when it comes to conceptual scope or the conceptual delimitation, even though economic statecraft is a very popular concept in social sciences, especially in politics and IR, the and that was emerged in these two disciplines in the post-Cold War period. However, when BRI was launched, the scholarly attention to this particular concept to understand the Chinese characteristics which are attached to this concept can be seen in the academia. Therefore, I thought to use this lens to look at what is Chinese intention, that why China wants to have BRI, why China wants to have such engagement with the smaller states via BRI. So that's the basic idea of using such conceptual delimitation. Um, so here I try to demonstrate to you amid all the scholarly definition what sort of picture that is in my mind about economic statecraft. It is needless to say this was designed based on the scholarly interpretations on economic statecraft. Here I have based on three seminal work on economic statecraft, such as David Baldwin's influence attempt on economic interactions to change the behavior of others, and Chris Norris' state firms agency theory to comprehend China's go global strategy via economic means, and Blanchard and Ritzman's the effectiveness of stateness and its ability to determine the success of economic statecraft have put into together to comprehend China, the economic statecraft with Chinese characteristics. And I am not going to give you more descriptive details on this conceptual framework, but if you need me to clarify anything, I can do that in QA session. And when it comes to intervention, this is one of the concepts that I try to employ in my research to uh, to convince that it is the economic statecraft is not the general economic statecraft that China is practicing today. It has its own characteristics. That is why Chinese economic statecraft is very much unique. So we know that intervention is inseparably linked to the concept of national sovereignty, even though now there are some contexted debate on the significance of national sovereignty in this complexly interdependent world. However, economically powerful actors, both state actors as well as non-state actors, are using economic tools as the mode of intervention in this nuclear age. And as economic capability is an influential source of power, there is a possibility to convert that economic power into any form of power based on the national interest of that particular country or the commercial interest of that particular non-state actor, like to hard power, soft power, or smart power. Therefore, the major argument that drives this entire discussion is that BRI could intervene into its partner countries' boundaries in the form of permissive intervention, enhancing its geostrategy to accomplish its national interest. So this argument is extensively illustrated along with Sri Lanka's experiences hereafter. To understand Chinese economic statecraft or the with Chinese characteristics, I should acknowledge the recent parameters presented by Craster and Margaret Pearson through their recent publication. China's growing overseas economic footprint is assessed using four parameters by them. For this study, I have used only three parameters. The one parameter was not used because I don't have empirical data with me at the moment to relate that into Sri Lanka's case study. So the first parameter that they used is to understand the Chinese economic statecraft is the intention, whether we can think of China's aim in promoting foreign economic ties as how it happens. So according to them, they have identified three broad categories. The one is advancing China's foreign policy and geostrategic goals. Secondly, seeking to strengthening the national economy. And thirdly, advancing the commercial interest of particular firms. And I want to mention that these categories, moreover, are not mutually exclusive. If we look at the first category, which is advancing China's foreign policy and geostrategic goals, this tells that how China enhancing its soft power and status power in the world and promoting a very convincing development model to poorer countries, and the initiatives like Belt Road Initiative thus promotes connectivities, not not the connectivities among top to top, state to state top levels, but also the connectivities among and within people as well. So we can see the socio-cultural dimension within that as well. And apart from that, the military dimension of China's intention is very imperative to understand, because these connectivity projects ultimately enable China to push into a central position, which that China can control the global military spectrum. And apart from that, there are some narratives with regard to this debt trap diplomacy, and I have mixed thoughts on that. However, if we go to the second category of the intention, the seeking to strengthen the national economy, due to the overcapacity, which is a national weakness of China, however, has been addressed in a smart way using these sort of visionary initiatives. And CCP, Chinese Communist Party's pressure on Chinese firms to go global has started to intensify since financial crisis in 2008. Ever since, we can see that private-public partnership were expanded through these BRI projects. And the third category, advancing commercial interest of particular firms, that is also very interesting thing, because we can see that China is um, trying to make an influence attempt using this private-public partnership. And the second parameter that I would like to relate here is the mechanisms of influence. What are the basic China's foreign economic ties that might translate into political influence? So it is interesting to see that how China uses its economic ties as the source of bargaining power. And also, secondly, these economic ties can generate new interest groups in the countries, especially the elites and the public, that have favorable voice towards China. And thirdly, these economic ties can help to shape the broader structural power as well, because simply we can take the example how US dollars became as the global currency in the world. Like that, China may have legitimacy to claim such structural powers due to these economic strengths that they have. And third parameter is firms as state agents. So this is also a very interesting case, because theories of economic statecraft make it very clear in the modern world that firms act as the agents of states to build the international image of the state. From other words, they perform as the brand ambassadors of the state. And almost policy discussions of China also take this for granted to make an alignment between CCP, Chinese Communist Party, and the state-owned enterprises. Now let's see what is the tragedy of this strategy, paying special attention to Sri Lankan case study. Now, from here onwards, I'm discussing the consequences of Chinese economic statecraft along with the nature of permissive intervention. Now, China agreeing to finance Hambantota port was like a dream came true. Rajapaksa regime, the former president of Sri Lanka. On the other hand, external sources is very crucial, very critical to Sri Lanka for its post-war infrastructure building. And maritime initiative under BRI has become substantial opportunity for Sri Lanka as an island nation, which hopes to transforming its own country into hub for sea transport, aviation, business, energy, and knowledge. The port of Hambantota, it was an artificially constructed port, and that is very strategic as well as advantageous due to the short transit time to India, Africa, and Upper Gulf, and it creates an opportunity to enter into larger consuming markets of the Indian subcontinent, even though it has that sort of advantages. The way that China pushed Sri Lanka into a trap to lease it out to China for 99 years was the strategy, because due to this project, even though Sri Lanka needs infrastructure to build its own country, there are some domestic things that fix first before investing on such big projects in Sri Lanka. Ultimately, what has happened with this skyrocketing debt and all those of things, Sri Lanka lost the decision-making power and economic sovereignty due to debt sustainability. Ultimately, Sri Lanka had to lease it out for China for 99 years. And the other consequence is there is a growing asymmetric dependence. And Sri Lanka is overly dependent on China at the moment. We can see an extra tilt towards China, or from other words, we can say Sri Lanka is bandwagoning with China rather than making multiple alliances as a small state. That's because now China ultimately put Sri Lanka into a position that that is the only alternative mean that Sri Lanka is having to go ahead with their development agenda. And the third consequence is the caution, vulnerability to caution, because even though this is not that much manifested in such a way, such a violent way, but the recent visit of high-profile defense minister to Sri Lanka indicates the military dimension of Chinese economic statecraft into Sri Lanka, which is very suspectable because even Sri Lankan people did not know the purpose of having such a visit to Sri Lanka unless the Chinese official website cited, mentioned what is the purpose of this visit. So that's how the public get to know things about Sri Lanka relationship at the moment. And the fourth consequence is domestic politics rendering Sri Lanka's vulnerability to exploitation of the great power. And that is a domestic issue that Sri Lanka has to address immediately. But as a developing country, as a small, poorer South Asian country, it has corruption, it has transparency issues. So unless otherwise Sri Lanka addresses those issues, it is very much vulnerable to greater powers, and greater powers can exploit it the way that they want. And in conclusion, what I really like to say is Sino-Sri Lanka relationship is asymmetric, intrinsically asymmetric since its inception, and BRI can perceived as a strategy of economic statecraft which enables China to get the control over its territory through its economic capacity. And there are some narratives that whether China will become another Djibouti in the South Asian continent. Even though their approach is unconditional, their diplomatic skills and propaganda is very effective to put the partner country into a position to embrace its hands. And this ultimately caused to lose the sovereignty as well as the autonomy of the weaker state like Sri Lanka. And even though we know any asymmetric relationship in this world can exist as a normal relationship, like theoretically, but Sino-Sri Lanka relationship has come to a position which we can see some pathological characteristics, pathological dynamics due to lack of effective domestic variables like the leverage power, bargaining power, diplomatic strength to control the Chinese factor. Therefore, China's smartness in using its own economic muscles to bend our own foreign policy towards her favor is very much active at the moment. And Hambantota Port is the classic example. Not only that, we can relate what is happening in Port City at the moment too. And growing asymmetric dependence ultimately leads to vulnerability, cost, and sensitivity. Therefore, smaller BRI countries should focus on how to balance competitors as well as these partnerships as a realistic mean of survival. And I propose that having multilateral alliances with multiple countries, not only with greater powers, but also with other smaller states, will enable Sri Lanka to get back its position as a normative leader in the South Asian continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kulani, for this interesting presentation. And now I am pleased to present our second speaker. He is Muhammad Wakar Anwar, who is here in my left side. He is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Defense and Security Studies here at Mass University. Muhammad has completed a Master in International Relations from National Defense University, Islamabad, and he has also a second Master in International Relations from the National University of Modern Languages in Islamabad. His research interests include climate change politics and environmental justice, terrorism, and non-traditional security challenge vis-a-vis the Belt and Road Initiative. He has also worked in various think tanks, and he has published many articles in local journals in Pakistan. Wakar is also an executive member here at the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, and he is one of the organizers of this workshop. So you have the floor, Wakar. Thank you very much.
So I will leave this control presentation.
Yes.
Can I share this?
Yes, you can. You can go to Zoom, open the Zoom window. Yeah. And press OK for this. And go to share screen. And select the PP left side. Yeah, right. Right.
Yeah, so thank you, Priscilla, for giving me the opportunity to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative. So I am a bit further in my research, and I was quite interested to see the topic and the work done by Kulani. So my work is also quite similar to my previous colleague, as it's like on the China's investment in the Belt and Road Initiative, and my case study is basically on Pakistan. So basically today the objective of my presentation is to give my listeners, my audience, like an idea of the theoretical debate around the Belt and Road Initiative and how different theoretical perspectives are being formulated and reformulated and combined together to form models to understand the various aspects of this project. So just to give a brief kind of introduction. So this is a map from the Mercator Institute of China Studies. So this institute has done a lot of tremendous work on this an excellent work on the Belt and Road Initiative and the various projects. So just to briefly introduce, like it's 65 countries and the amount is roughly quoted as $1 trillion, although it's like contested in some. If you go through various sources, you will find a variety of like the total cost of this project. So now moving to my presentation, which is today, I want to discuss like how Chinese infrastructure results in the domination of the weak states in its periphery. So China is investing like in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, in Afghanistan, in Central Asian countries. So how this influence is resulting in creating an atmosphere of instability or insecurity in the recipient countries. So for this, like for my research, I am using basically one of the orthodoxies in international relations, which is structural power. So this was a concept developed by Susan Strange back in 1988. She was a professor of international relations in the London School of Economics. So actually, this states that structural power is a relational power. When the dominant states wants to, dominate the structure of the security and structure of production and structure of finance and structure of knowledge of the recipient countries. So it has two basically main components. One is it's operationalized at the system level, and like the international system, and the state level. So in the international system level, it is just like having a dominance in the global system vis-a-vis the other countries and other states. And at the state level, it is like looking through the trade, foreign direct investment, and the presence of dominant states forms. So just to give you a brief example of this, like how, just to give you a glimpse of how the Chinese power and the asymmetric, as my previous colleague also mentioned these terms, I'm using those again, like asymmetrical relationships. So if we see like these countries like Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and some of the other countries, so if you see like the trade with China, the trade volume of China with Pakistan. So it is only 0.6% of the total trade volume of China. So the whole trade volume of Pakistan vis-a-vis China is only 0.6% when it is related to the Chinese trade, overall trade volume. So this is just like a brief, you can say a tweak towards how, for understanding how the relationship is in the economic sense, it is so much, like one country being on the top of the iceberg and the other country just on the water. And the second component of this model, which I'm using in my research, is the weak state. So according to Max Weber, if we take there is no, first of all, I want to clarify, there is no specific definition of the weak state. So, but according to Max Weber, the modern state constitutes, so we have just taken the definition of Max Weber, and he defines the modern state as an effective institution, legitimate government, and state control over the society. So if we put these terms on the other side of the spectrum, we can define the weak state as, having weak institutions, deficiencies in state legitimacy, and the poor state-society relations. So for this purpose, I have used this definition. And then the third component of this model, the power state and violence model, is the structural violence. So often when I talk to people regarding my theoretical framework, and then I tell them about that my model is like power, weak state, and the violence. So they get the idea like he's talking about violence in a real sense. But this is not the case. So structural violence is like from the uneven distribution of resources, exploitation, social injustice, and abuses of state power. So it is not like violence per se, like it can be in the form of environmental degradation. It can be in the form of, debt, like my previous colleague mentioned, debt trap diplomacy, or it can be in the form of public inacceptance of the projects and resulting protests and the conflict between the government and the people. So this is like my third pillar of the theoretical framework which I am using. So just to put it in a limelight, if we consider how structural power impacts the weak state, so it kind of moves into these structures of production, the knowledge production, the security, and the finance, and then it moves in through the institutionals, and then it creates some kind of instability or insecurity. So, for example, I will just give you some brief example of how this works. So, in the realm of knowledge production, we see a lot of Confucius institutes which are propping up in all over the BRI recipient countries, and Pakistan is no exception. So we see a lot of Chinese, in every university they have created a Confucius Center, and they are promoting their language. Even they have plans to launch their own media channel, and they are like also going to take control over the media and the, dissemination of knowledge. So this is just one example, like how they will influence the narrative of the state of Pakistan vis-a-vis China. So there will be no, if there is any criticism, they will try to, manipulate, and spin doctors will be there to, put the information towards their own interest. So similarly, if we see in the structure of production, we can see a lot of Chinese firms coming in Pakistan, and they are like investing in those sectors which were erstwhile constituted of the indigenous production, like the shoemaking industry. So now I can tell you with guarantee that all of this industry has been taken over by China. And similarly, the dyeing industry. So there was initially some resistance against these projects, like the special economic zones which the China is creating. But with the passage of time, due to the narrative and due to the lack of right approach, you can say, of the institutions, the institutional weakness, that resulted in the culmination of the complete kind of the indigenous labor and the indigenous industry is almost on the verge of collapse. So similarly, the structure of finance, my previous colleague quite elaborated, like it is quite evident in the case of Sri Lanka. But when we speak of Pakistan, it is no different, because there are also some discussion about the debt issues and some of the projects, specifically the power projects, and some other projects, even in the port city of Gwadar, there are some projects which were earlier on they were given some tax exemptions, and then they were taken back, and then they were given again. So this is the kind of institutional weakness which kind of hinders the smooth implementation of these projects. And it also, you can plus it or add it with the lack of the right approach in terms of the negotiations of the project and the, the execution of the projects. So similarly, in the structure, in the security domain, we see the Chinese narrative is being more popularized, although there is quite a lot of resistance against the Chinese in some of the areas in Pakistan. So, but still, there is also presence of the institutional weakness over there as well. So I will explain this later in the next slide. Yes, so just to clarify, like, although it appears to be like a theoretical framework, which is just, presenting a negative image of the Chinese investment, but this is not the case because the main feature of this is like it doesn't ascribe the intentionality to the dominant state. So it is not saying that China is intentionally doing this in these investment projects. And then it tries to explore it also gives space to explore the institutional weakness, as also mentioned by Fulani, because the developing countries' institutions are not that much strong to take the right approach to deal with the Chinese negotiators. So it just like it is going to unpack the tension points in the BRI and their potential ramifications. So the conclusion, as far as in this point of my journey, I will stick to this conclusion, is that the Western scholarship tends to portray this project mostly in a critical, quite critical manner, whereas in the countries like Pakistan, where most of the think tanks are funded by the government and the military institutions, they are also producing research literature, so they tend to produce it in a, like they try to paint a rosy picture of the project, especially the Western scholarship, I'm talking about the 5 countries, specifically Australia, New Zealand, Canada, UK, and the United States. So there seems to be like a kind of a tug of war kind of a situation. So, but I will position like the reality is like somewhere between, because these projects are also adding value to the existing economic engines in the recipient countries. People are getting jobs. There is, increased activity regarding like Chinese investment projects in the power sector were really appreciated because Pakistan faces a lot of challenges related to the power consumption. We had a discussion in the earlier panels as well. So, but also there are some partial economic benefits, but you can say that downsides of this project can't be neglected either. So we see a lack of a right approach, as we mentioned in the earlier presentation as well. And there is an uneven investment landscape, or you can say inequitable distribution of resources, to put in more economic jargon. And there are some pre-existing ethnic and intrastate fault lines because one of the province in Pakistan, like the Balochistan province, that was deprived of the investment even before the Chinese investment came in. So the same scenario continues today. And if we talk to the politicians from their side, so they will be saying that we are not getting the chunk of projects we should have. So this is the case of Balochistan. So I brought this here because this is a classic case to tell how, and like the CPEC projects under the framework of BRI, they are creating, although they are projected as increasing the economic profile of the states, and the Chinese are really, they're sincere in their, objectives, but still we see a kind of an uneven distribution, and the security situation is also like not that good. There are attacks on the Chinese laborers, there are attacks on their hotels where they are staying. And recently there was a merger of the various groups, like there are 2 or 3 groups, Balochistan Liberation Army, Balochistan Liberation Force, they are fighting against the state and they are saying that China is an alien who is taking over their land. So they have formed a united front to confront the state. So all of these things are there, and although the regional factors cannot be neglected, but still like it has both a positive and a negative side. So I just wanted to discuss the model which I'm using to to interact with you people and get some feedback as well, and I will learn from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Waka, for this very interesting presentation. And now I am pleased to introduce you to Ike Freeman, who is a doctoral candidate. Are all listening? I think, I don't know if they are listening, please.
Yes.
Okay. Can you unmute, please?
Yes. Can you hear me all right?
Sorry, I was introducing you. Sorry, Ike, for this technical issue. So Ike is a doctoral candidate at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies at the University of Oxford. He was previously a researcher at the Belfer Center, Harvard Kennedy School, and the Hoover Institution at Stanford. He is the author of the book One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World. And the title of his presentation today is Ideology and Infrastructure, the Many Phases of Xi Jinping Legacy Project. Thank you very much, Ike, for joining us today. We want to listen at you, please. It's mute. Can you unmute yourself?
There. How's this?
Yeah,
Better?
good, very good.
Well, thank you, Priscilla, for hosting. Thank you to these other two very interesting presentations. I don't know why this, here we go. Of course, here we go, beginning of my presentation. So I've just written this book. It was out last November through Harvard University Press. It's called One Belt, One Road, Chinese Power Meets the World. And it engages with many of the themes that we've been talking about today, but more from a Chinese domestic politics perspective, which is the field that I come out of. And I begin with the plug for the book, not only to encourage you to track it down and take a look at it, but also because the deliberately provocative cover art was chosen for a reason. One of the arguments that I make in the book, and which I will try to make to you in my brief remarks today, is that Xi Jinping has used the Belt and Road Initiative to create a narrative, a legitimizing narrative that it essentially is intended to write his way into the history books by putting his own legacy into juxtaposition with some of the most glorious and revered emperors in Chinese history. Xi Jinping is not the first Communist Party leader to seek an historical avatar. Mao Zedong, the founder of the PRC, famously compared himself to Chen Shihuang, the founding emperor of the Qin dynasty, the ruthless unifier who created the modern Chinese state as we understand it today for the first time. But Xi Jinping has picked a different historical analogy, and one whose reign was in many ways longer and more glorious than Qin Shi Huang's, and that is Emperor Han Di, the third emperor of the Han Dynasty, who ruled from 141 to 87 BC. And I'm going to show you today some screenshots from Belt and Road propaganda videos that are explaining to domestic Chinese audiences what this initiative is actually about. And I'll talk a little bit about revisions to Chinese history textbooks, which have furthered this comparison in many small ways by bringing the ancient history of Han Di's life into alignment with what Xi Jinping is trying to do. It is no small thing for a Chinese leader to compare himself to Han Di. This is a man whose reign spanned 5 decades, a man who doubled the territorial extent of the Han Empire. He invaded Korea, partly successfully. He invaded Vietnam successfully. He annexed many of the southern provinces that are now China's economic heartland, the provinces of Fujian, Guangdong, Guangxi, Yunnan. And he launched a series of military incursions into Central Asia. in what is now Gansu province, which is this area that is shaded red with diagonal bars. That is the Huxi corridor, and it is the route that connects the more fertile lands of coastal China to Central Asia. Hanudi never lived to see the annexation of the so-called Western regions, what is now modern-day Xinjiang province. This is outlined in red on the left side of this map, but his successors did. So he established garrisons that went out into Central Asia. He established diplomatic relations with some of these states, which at that time were basically unaware of the power of the Han state and were in thrall to the Huns. In Chinese, they call them the Xiongnu. They were a horse riding nomadic people from the Central Asian steppe, and they would come in and rape and pillage and have a reign of terror, and could establish a form of tributary relations with the small kingdoms in the Western regions. So there is a notion that was invented in the 20th century that Hanudi invented the ancient Silk Road because the diplomatic exercises that he undertook to interact with some of these Central Asian states ultimately led to the Western Region Protectorate, which annexed some of these territories to China and which improved the amount of trade that went back and forth east to west. But really, according to traditional Chinese historiography, Hanudi himself had nothing to do with the founding of the ancient Silk Road. The Silk Road routes were not a particular route. It was a sort of a metaphor for a network of trade that emerged over hundreds of years and didn't really enter its golden age until almost 1,000 years after his death. The notion that Hanudi was the founder of the ancient Silk Road is credited to this man, Sven Hedin, who is a fascinating character in East Asian history. He was a Nazi sympathizing Swede. He was a personal friend and correspondent of Adolf Hitler, and he had a grand vision that the Third Reich should partner with Chiang Kai-shek's republic in China, and that they should build a transcontinental network of rail and roads and even aviation. So in order to persuade the Chinese and the Germans that this was a worthwhile investment, he concocted an ancient history of the Silk Road that involved a more active Chinese role and which he thought was more glorious, hoping that this could persuade the Chinese that their nationalistic impulses could be sated if they funded this thing. Now, Hedin failed. All of the Chinese historians and commentators at the time spoke of this dismissively. They called it the so-called Silk Road because no term existed in the Chinese language to describe the East-West trade routes. And it wasn't actually until the late 1970s and early 1980s that the People's Republic of China began to use Silk Road as a metaphor in their diplomatic exchanges. And they tended to use it when they were talking to Central Asia, and they use it all the more after the breakup of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, because many of these newly formed Central Asian republics had contested borders with China, and Beijing wanted to reassure them that all it wanted to do was trade, and it wasn't trying to invade them or annex them as the Soviet Union had done. So with this background in mind, what Xi Jinping has done, or Xi Jinping's propaganda department has done in trying to communicate what the Belt and Road Initiative is about, is they have manufactured a series of historical documentaries, exhibitions, textbook changes that write this, as we know, 20th century completely concocted backstory to the Silk Road into the historical record books so that it looks very similar to what Xi Jinping is trying to do today. For example, these following screenshots come from a series that was produced by Chinese Central Television. It featured Henry Kissinger, Vladimir Putin, all of these foreign luminaries to show that this is the real deal. This is the serious document of what the Belt and Road is trying to do. It opens with a cut of Xi Jinping announcing the initiative in Kazakhstan with the glorious triumphal music, and then it cuts to this scene. Han Yu-di with his messenger Zhang Qian cutting the way open into Central Asia. And in the final minutes of my talk, I just want to run through a few of these images because I think they tell us a lot about the narratives of what China is trying to do with this, or at least how they're trying to justify the enterprise of spending resources abroad to their own population. So Xi Jinping is not the only character in this story. Equally important is his loyal emissary, Zhang Qian. And the two work together. Xi Jinping is the visionary, and Zhang Qian is the person who goes out to execute, who suffers many struggles and travails. He's imprisoned, he escapes on his journey, but he's willing to bear all of that pain and difficulty in order to further the leader's goals. This is, of course, a metaphor for what Chinese citizens, what Chinese companies, Chinese institutions are supposed to do. They're supposed to be willing to sacrifice in order to carry out the scheme. And obviously working together, the vision and the action establishes this unparalleled era of power, wealth, and unity, which is important inside the Chinese state. So here's how it works, essentially. Cut to ancient Rome, where we see Westerners in togas. Chinese goods arrive for the first time. We have this montage of Westerners oohing and eyeing over silk. They've never seen anything so beautiful. Clearly, Chinese products are superior. And this creates a broader philosophical point that China doesn't just have better technology and better products. They have Oriental wisdom. They have Dongfang Zhihui, which is a model for relations between states, which are lubricated by trade, and therefore there's no conquest. So obviously the Chinese state never invades anyone. They never have any diplomatic military issues over 1,000 years. We can skip all of that. And all of a sudden we're in the 1500s. So Western science and political models, we are told, fail on both counts. First of all, this is Eratosthenes, who can't even calculate the size of the Earth. And here are Western ships trying to find a faster way to China, but instead discovering the New World and embarking on this scary, dark era of world history in which the Western model of win-lose destroys everything. So contrast the Chinese golden era of camels in the desert to the European model of trade monopoly. Everything gets dark, the music gets scary, there's explosions, they're taking over the world, the environment is destroyed, there's chaos, there's destruction, there's war. And look, even New York City, even America is a complete mess. And so we're told when the music gets bright, the Chinese Communist Party stands up in 1949 and says, well, why don't we set about restoring this ancient order? So in the course of about a 30-second montage, we see some Chinese workers trying to build a car with wooden sticks, to printing, to building cars, to building high-speed rail, and finally taking over the outer space. So boom, that was not very difficult to catch up because China has this flair. They have Oriental wisdom, so the technology will not be a problem. They can catch up very quickly. And once again, in the space of just a few years, the rest of the world, the third world, is looking not to the West, but to China to share its technology and products. And it's not just these countries, it's little girls in these countries. And who can say no to Karina, this little girl in Kyrgyzstan who just wants to take a fast train and see what's out there. And her country can't afford fast trains, but China can. So this is the concluding point. What does China gain from all of this? Well, China gains stability and China gains status. The point is that foreigners will come to love China because of everything that China does for them. and individuals and companies that go out into the world that sacrifice on behalf of the Chinese state will become diplomats of a kind. They will form relationships with their foreign partners that will last for the long term and bring all kinds of recognition back to China. And in turn, when the time comes, the foreigners will raise their glasses and they will toast to China for bringing light to their primitive existence. That's a quote from the documentary, for giving them electricity, for giving them infrastructure, and for sharing their Oriental wisdom. So this, in conclusion, in a 15-minute summary, is the pitch that Xi Jinping and his propaganda department have made to the Chinese people about why it is a worthwhile enterprise to spend trillions of dollars overseas. It's a different question than how the infrastructure projects themselves are planned or implemented. It doesn't mean that everyone in the Chinese state has the same vision, but this is a narrative and an analogy that politically aware Chinese individuals fully understand, whether or not they would acknowledge it. And I think it is important when we try to approach the Belt and Road Initiative that we not just think about China as a black box that is pursuing economic interests solely. There are domestic political motivations that relate to legitimizing Xi Jinping's own role in the system, in legitimizing the Communist Party's historical position in the development of the Chinese state. And these are narratives that need to be listened to and I think studied quite carefully. Thank you. I will pause there.
And I don't know exactly if our fourth guest has arrived. Is Dr. Khorram Iqbal here?
Asking for the Zoom link.
Has he arrived or?
He's just going to sign in.
He's going to, okay, we are just waiting for the speaker. And meanwhile, I'm going to introduce him. His name is, he's the Dr. Khorram Iqbal. He is the head of the Department of International Relations at National Defense University in Islamabad, Pakistan. He holds a PhD in international security studies, and he has worked with top research centers and universities in Pakistan, Singapore, and Australia. His research areas include counterterrorism, South Asian security, and China's Belt and Road Initiative. The title of his presentation is Reshaping of Elite Patronage vis-a-vis the BRI. So,
do you know the password?
With the link, can he access?
He's joining.
Has he joined?
Yeah, yes.
No,
You.
no, this one, different.
All
It
right.
says Iqbal, Dr. Khorram Iqbal.
You need to set the password.
Oh,
Alright.
the link, he does not have the link. Sorry for this pause. We are just waiting for the speaker. Isn't it? Okay. Actually reset it. Yes, okay. Okay, so okay, so perhaps meanwhile we wait for the speaker. We can begin with some comments. If you have some comments on the meantime, we can begin with this. Can you unmute, please, everybody?
Sure. They will have to do it from their end.
Ah, okay. So if you want to speak, you can unmute by yourselves. I would like to say some comments to Ike. I have comments for all of you.
Sure.
But I particularly liked Ike's presentation because I am fascinated with the subject of propaganda, and particularly the topic of visual propaganda. And I'm very interested on how, at studying this Chinese propaganda and the uses of history of how the Silk Road can be seen nowadays and all the narrative that they use nowadays to, I imagine, to promote the BRI. And I would like to ask you, I mean, from the point of view of your studies, which are the challenges that you find at studying Chinese propaganda? Because I imagine that, well, they use completely another visual codes, another iconographies, another, sorry, so let me finish. Another discourse is completely another visual discourse. So I imagine that this is completely a challenge view from an Occidental, let's say, point of view. I don't know if perhaps you know much more this culture, but I think visual is very challenging. What do you think about this?
Well, I am a great propaganda nerd. I think you kind of have to love it, because if you hate it, it's one of the things that cannot be said about propaganda is that it is subtle. The point of propaganda is that it must be understood by the lowest common denominator. It is not for people with an active, detailed knowledge of current events. It is for politically disengaged individuals. It is for children. It is for creating a very simple set of national narratives or codes that can be used to achieve social cohesion or to legitimize an individual or a regime. So propaganda in any language is generally pretty straightforward as long as you can understand what they are saying. In the case of these CCTV propaganda videos, they actually put them on YouTube with English language subtitles, so anyone can watch them. I showed you the screenshots from the English language video, so I didn't have to translate. Sometimes there are some minor translation issues, so that what they will put in the English language subtitles will be somehow not quite what they are actually communicating in Chinese, but most of the time it's pretty similar. And I think you can learn a great deal just by watching them. Obviously, the more you watch, the more you gain. There is a sort of symbolic code. There is a structure to the way that they do things. But generally speaking, it's pretty obvious the messages that they're trying to say. I think the more interesting question is, what can we learn about actual politics and policy from propaganda? Because just because the Chinese regime is trying to convince its population of something doesn't mean that those are the way that the elites actually think. It doesn't mean that those are actually their motives. They're trying to achieve a domestic political goal, but that might not have anything to do with their overseas foreign objectives. So you have to look at it as part of a broader analysis. I think that some of the comments that were made earlier about Chinese geoeconomic statecraft are very accurate. Chinese economic planners, big state-owned enterprises, when they interact with countries like Sri Lanka, are not thinking about the legacy of the ancient Silk Road at all. That is gravy for them. They're focused on political access, on satisfying whatever metrics or requirements they're being told that they have to meet, and avoiding embarrassing the leader. And so there's a set of domestic incentives that are how Chinese politics work, right? How lower and middle level officials and institutions are incentivized to follow the party line. And using slogans and participating in propaganda is one way that they meet what is expected of them. But that doesn't mean that their actual objectives when they do deals overseas have anything to do with the propaganda. So it's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, I was thinking, I don't know if we could recognize the same propaganda outside China that inside China. No? That perhaps there's something that we don't know. Nowadays, we talk about the wall of China is exactly this inability to access the media world in China. So I don't know if the media sent abroad, well, we cannot say it's the same message that is the message inside. But well, these are just ideas to think about.
One of the, no, it's a very good point. There's a scholar at the University of Canterbury, New Zealand, named Anne-Marie Brady, who is the best anywhere on Chinese propaganda. Right. And she talks about a version of propaganda that is called exoprop, and that's external propaganda. And it's made by a separate, at least it used to be when she did her analysis, made by a separate bureau within the Central Propaganda Department. And it's generally considered less important than propaganda for domestic audiences. And in the case of the Belt and Road, it tells a very different story. It has nothing to do with Xi Jinping's historical avatar. It says China is the defender of globalization and the international order. Don't be afraid of China. Win-win. It has a totally different message. And when you put the two side by side, it becomes quite clear that China is communicating what this is in very different ways to its own people and to foreigners. But it has also been sloppy in doing it because they put their domestic stuff up on YouTube and anyone can watch it if they please.
Nice. Well, they're very interesting. Well, I'm going to look for it's Brady, right? Well, you know her. Yes. Sorry, I don't know if our fourth speaker is here already.
Yeah, actually, we're sending an invitation to
okay.
Small groups.
Not able to.
There's some technical problems.
Okay. Well, we are trying to reach Dr. Iqbal, but in the meantime, do you have any comments or would you like to add something else? Can you unmute, please?
Everybody's unmute.
Okay.
Or they can unmute whenever
okay.
they want to speak to.
Excuse me, may I add something?
Yeah, sure.
Good day, everyone. Hello, how are you? My intake is that we should start something like intercultural gains and feasibility of the studies of the project in order to understand better what is BRI and what is the significance of BRI among all the global states. What do you think on that?
Who would like to answer?
Yes, ma'am. Please add something.
Sure. Would you like to add something else? Or?
Yes, yes, definitely.
Who would like to answer?
Yeah, I can go ahead, like, because yes, because of the differences in the culture between China and the recipient countries, there is a discussion about, introducing some cultural interactions between the people of the recipient countries and that of China. So yes, the Chinese are trying their level best to like having these kind of initiatives to I also mentioned like the propaganda thing as well. So they have to like make it in a way that they can freely intermingle with the people of these countries. So yeah, there are some things are going on in this domain as well. But at the same time, we cannot, oversee the other aspects of these projects or the Chinese investment or the Chinese influence at the same time. So although they are trying their level best to introduce some cultural activities, they are trying to introduce their language, they are trying to, giving scholarships to the students to come to China, and they are organizing various programs. But it's like a picture with two sides. So we have to look on the both of the sides to understand it clearly.
Okay, Kulani, would you like to add something about this?
Yes, may I add something to what Anwar explained with regard to socio-cultural dimension of BRI, even though I don't have much of empirical data, but if I explain it the way this is now, during this COVID-19 period, that we could see that how much China is smart enough to extend their maritime Silk Road and Belt Road initiative into other two initiatives, like how they provide medical assistance to the countries, BRI recipient countries, through their health Silk Road. So that is pretty much interesting case how China extended their hand in order to provide PPEs, vaccines, and how to let those countries to go to WHO and get the approval to use their own Sinopharm vaccine. So the best example is what Sri Lanka did amid this third wave of pandemic. Sri Lanka went to WHO and negotiated with them to use Sinopharm vaccine in case of emergency. But now in the local context that we can see in local areas, that Sri Lanka has also started to give the vaccination, the Chinese vaccination, along with the Indian and the Russian one. So these things shows how Belt Road Initiative has evolved with the challenges, with the changes, uh, to achieve the strategic ends that they expect to gain through this amid a pandemic is existing in the world. And on the other hand, there are four Confucius centers were established in Sri Lanka with the partnership with some state universities. So through these institutions, they promote their language, they promote their culture, which is anyway a good thing from one angle, because in this globalized world, we need to have such cultural exchanges. But on the other hand, there are some undiscovered socio-cultural impact of such engagement has too. For example, the impact of Confucius centers on the academic integrity of that particular institution was not discovered yet, even though that is very much visible in the academic institutions in Sri Lanka. And on the other hand, there's another fact that I can add here is the Chinese laborers who work at BRI projects in Sri Lanka. There are pro and anti narrative with regard to that, how um, how we can perceive Chinese laborers in Sri Lanka. From one hand, some scholars argue that, especially local scholars argue that there's only a small portion of Chinese laborers consist within the Sri Lankan labor force. But on the other hand, there's another side, how this impacts on the employability of Sri Lanka. It is like artificial intelligence one day replace the human with their artificial intelligence, the computers and equipment. Now with these initiatives and their own laborers, we lose our employability as well. So it is not just an economic factor, it has some socio-cultural factors as well. And the food culture that they have, how that impacts on our own native food culture, that is also very controversial public opinion on socio-cultural aspect of their presence in Sri Lanka. Apart from that, I would like to add on top of that the environmental impact, which just not has only economic or political dimension, it has some socio-cultural dimension too. Because even though there are some environmental impact assessment reports, it is very surprising to see how these things bypassed and initiated such projects in Sri Lanka amid the public pressure. So yes, I think it's very good if we can have such socio-cultural scenario analysis about Belt Road initiatives in different countries. I'm pretty sure there are some positive gains through BRI initiative, yet this should be balanced. So in order to balance that, I think refusing being a member of BRI by India, USA is not the option, right? I think their presence in this initiative is essential to balance one party dictatorship over one particular initiative, because different perspectives are needed to balance such initiative to gain balanced outcomes to all recipient countries. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Kulani. Well, we have other questions on the chat. Can you please read them?
Sure. We've got a question from Steve. Steve has two questions. Let me read out his message. Is there any indication that military strategy is central to the development of BRI projects, or is military advantage an outcome that is realized only as an opportunity? On the topic of internal and external messaging as described by Ike, is there overt military posturing domestically while remaining more passive externally? Do you see the informational line of the three warfares present in this propaganda, or is the military effort a bespoke chain separate from BRI?
I think it was more a question for Ike, but would you like to say something? Kulani first.
It's a long question, I understand. We can refer the chat window to see the parts of the question.
Hi, sorry, it's Steve. I was happy with either one part or two. I guess the first part being more general to the folks that started off with their idea of the BRI, and no one really kind of talked about is there or is there not a military connection. And so with the example of the Sri Lankan port, where only after there was development, there was kind of more of a forcing of an opportunity for the Chinese Navy to take advantage of the port in Sri Lanka. I was wondering from the folks that are specifically looking at the Belt and Road, if they see a continuum while it's being developed with military strategy aligned, or is it something that just comes afterwards? And then for Ike specifically, was that separation, or is there also a continuum where the three warfares is present in the BRI messaging, or is military messaging completely separate from it? So I guess related, but different.
Yeah, okay, so I already left the meeting, but perhaps our other speakers would like to answer. Kulani, would you like to say something?
Yes, indeed, the military dimension is very much imperative in the BRI case, because as I argue that China started with their carrots or the economic incentives to ensure their access to that particular host country. by providing financial assistance or proposing investments. But afterwards, what happened was like they now the best example is the port city project in Sri Lanka that is being constructed at the moment with some terminations and so on and so forth. Now, after constructing it, what has happened was in order to launch the operations in the port city, they demanded Sri Lanka or put somehow Sri Lanka to propose a bill how to rule or operation the port city with along with other investors. So ultimately, Sri Lanka drafted act which is at the discussion at the moment. So we can say the same thing happened in Djibouti Islands as well when they invested to some special economic zones in the African strategic islands. And then what has happened to Djibouti is they could be able to establish their first military base beyond their territory for the first time in the history. And now Sri Lankans is also in a position to rethinking or rethinking and have some sort of suspicion where the same thing, same set of sequences of incidents are happening in Sri Lanka at the moment too. First, establishing economic zone, then bring a different act, how to operationalize it apart from the constitutional power of the country, and that is a separate bill. And then what is the agenda, what is the objective of having a high profile defense minister's arrival in Sri Lanka amid this very serious situation in the world, especially in the South Asian continent with the highest number of infectors in India and as well as in Sri Lanka. So the agenda is not very much clear or clearly manifest, but we can have some sort of predictions, projections, what sort of military dimension that China is really willing to establish with Sri Lanka. That is one case. On the other hand, few weeks ago, there was another controversial news that one shipment reached Hambantota port, which includes radium. On the way back to China, that was stopped at Hambantota port. So these things give a different picture to the world as well as to us. What is the need of such military involvement into small state like Sri Lanka? What's the reason? So I argue that in such context, since Sri Lanka is located amid the Indian Ocean and the China's strategic interest over the navigation in the Indian Ocean, they want to ensure their presence, their heavy presence in Sri Lanka. Therefore, not only from economic relationship, but also from military presence, they want to ensure it. Therefore, I think military dimension is elemental in Sino-Sri Lanka relationship through Belt Road Initiative.
Oh, fascinating. Bakar, would you like to add something?
Yeah, my take will be like there is like an element of the military involvement in these projects because we see like the Chinese navigation satellite system that is also being given to the recipient countries as like a token of appreciation. And the second thing is like most of the Chinese state-owned enterprises like the China Railways and other state-owned enterprises, they are like basically they were owned by the Chinese military in the start of the project. And if you talk specifically of the China-Pakistan relations, so there has been a heavy involvement of the Chinese and the Pakistani military in cooperation in various strategic areas. And there is a talk about the Gwadar port being built as a naval base in the near future. Like it can be used as a dual-use port, as the Chinese did in Djibouti. Their plans in Djibouti are the same, and in Ethiopia they are also the same. So, like they are trying to make a circle or a strategic ring to protect against the containment of China from the US. So yeah, there are some debates like this, as you mentioned. Yeah, and other factor is like not in Pakistan, but in other recipient countries, they are also investing in some private security companies. As there was in Libya, there was an incident about a few years back, and the Chinese had to send their naval ships to, take out their citizens from there. So the military aspect comes in the form of provision of the security to the Chinese, laborers who are working in these projects. So yeah, that's all what can I say.
Well, we are approaching to the end of our time. So I would like to thank everybody of you or the speakers who accepted this invitation and who joined us with these very interesting presentations. Obviously, there is a lot much to say about this topic. Sorry.
On the Zoom, we can connect it with the all meeting, if it's possible.
Sorry, you would like to connect?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Walker is going to share with us something before ending the session. Or are you going to share something?
Yeah, no, I'm thinking because he's added on this other Zoom link, so we can do the recording at the same time.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I need to close the session. Thank you very much, everybody. And let's hope we can have another meeting again. Thank you very much. Have a nice day, a nice afternoon, a good night. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you.